everyone, and welcome to Tea and Tales. We have Eric Andersen here today. We want to start by acknowledging that this program is taking place in the unceded territory of Lil'wat Nation. Thanks for coming and supporting this program, and just a reminder that we do film these for the historical record and we make them available on our website. This is the third in a series of 7 presentations that will feature speakers from Burton, Mount Currie, Pemberton, and Squamish. Our theme this year is local art, past and present. So what is art? Art is defined as the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Art also includes things like painting, music, literature, and dance. Why is art important? Art reflects and informs the culture from which it emerges. Art created reflects a time and a place and the values and beliefs of that place. Art can be considered a mirror that is held up to inspire reflection on what is and what was. In the past, local art wasn't the exception, it was the reality. Communicating and growing beyond local borders was largely impossible. However, it is local art that gives a community meaning and a sense of place, so it remains an important part of any community. Sometimes a place becomes famed by a work of a well-known artist, and what is considered local becomes world-renowned. Tom Thompson's Jack Pine painting, one of the most recognizable Canadian artworks, was originally sketched by Tom while hunting and fishing in Algonquin Park in Ontario. The painting is considered an iconic image of the country's landscape, and it's one of Canada's most widely recognized and reproduced artworks. Before Tom painted this image in 1917, few people had heard of Algonquin Park. Today, it sees over 2 million visitors. Emily Carr's Trips Through the Sea to Sky had a similar impact. Her interpretations of the mountain landscape have made certain scenes in the region iconic. Towering mountains, First Nation churches and totems, deep forests, and stormy seascapes. Emily forever changed how we see the place we call home. Today, I want to welcome Eric, who's visiting us from Squamish. Eric is a local historian with Squamish and Scandinavian roots. He's involved with the Sea to Sky Forestry Society, who celebrates Squamish's rich forest and lumbering history. He is also a counselor for the District of Squamish, and they're having a meeting on Tuesday, and this is why Eric is here a few days early. He's no stranger to the Pemberton Museum and has given us some wonderful presentations through the years, including some original research on the importance of the Pemberton Trail, Highway 99, as a critical transportation corridor from the interior to the coast. He has also presented original research about the history of the Barber family, who had settlement roots in Pemberton and Squamish. And he presented Pemberton in the World News, which was some original research about the last 150 years in Pemberton using historical newspaper clippings. And last year, he told us the story about Pemberton's maritime history and how developments in the region were linked to maritime explorations along the coast. As always, we're excited Eric has prepared another engaging presentation for us, and thanks to Eric for sharing all your research with us through the years. And thanks to all of you for supporting the program.
Well, thank you, Nikki. It's great to be back in Pemberton, here at Pemberton Museum for this kind of virtual presentation on the topic of modern art comes to Pemberton, with Emily Carr and other artists as well that we'll refer to. So why Emily Carr? Why do we keep coming back to her as an icon of British Columbia art, of British Columbia history, of British Columbia culture? Well, she's important to BC culture in a very broad sense. It's interesting that she's born during the year of Confederation, 1871. Her family was a prominent Victoria family during the colonial period. So she has deep BC roots from the settler era, if you like. And her travels covered most regions and districts of the province. And she's not only documenting her travels over a long career as an artist, in painting and sketching, but also in writing. Her relationship with Aboriginal peoples, we have to refer to this because it is unique. Wherever she lived, wherever she traveled, and she built up and maintained for a long period of time close relations with the Aboriginal peoples. Her significance for modern landscape painting: she was a pioneer modernist in Western Canada art, and she links our artistic traditions to modern art practitioners not only in Eastern Canada, but in Europe and the United States. Now, Emily Carr's trip in 1933 through what is today the Sea to Sky country on the PGE Railway, in all of the many books written about Emily Carr, there's not a lot that's written about this trip, and we have to go directly to her journals and look through the pages to find her commentary, which is not large but very interesting. That is until recently. We have a newly published book, Emily Carr's BC, by Laurie Carter. Laurie is a journalist and a writer of many books, and this is a third in a series of books covering Emily Carr's travels around the province, her life, her art, and in a very entertaining way. But for the first time, we have a whole chapter concerning her experiences and Laurie Carter's experiences following her Emily's trail here in the Sea to Sky corridor. Highly recommended. I've learned a great deal. Now, one of the fun things about following the story of an artist traveling here, or any personality traveling here, so long ago, 1933, when Emily was 62 years of age, by the way, is just what was going on back then. What was like this countryside? And so just to recap, her journey took 3.5 weeks traveling by railway, and leaving from Victoria through to Vancouver, and from Squamish she stayed 11 days approximately in Brackendale visiting with family, and then she went all the way up by the rail to Lillooet and made her way to perhaps to Fountain, according to the sketches that she's left behind, and coming back to Shalaf and Seton Portage, where she spent several days, and then in the Pemberton Valley as long as 1 week, staying at the Pemberton Hotel. And most of her writings and journals from this period, this episode, these 3.5 weeks, were in fact written in the Pemberton Hotel where she was staying. Then she returns back to Victoria and gets busy on finishing up her sketches and creating new oil works from her sketches, busy writing over the next few months. Now here we see Squamish in the early 1930s as she would have seen it. Just over here is the dock that she has arrived on with the Union Steamships Company. The railway would have taken her into town, where her niece's husband, Lawson Ray, would have picked her up, taken her to Brackendale in his pickup truck. Now, at the time, it's interesting, another traveler, the editor of the Chilliwack Progress newspaper, has this to report. Just a few weeks later than Emily, he reports how Sound was placid coming up on the steamship, as were also the industries located at Woodfibre and Britannia. These towns were waiting for a return of better times before steaming up. Well, we're in the middle of the Depression. There isn't any activity at Britannia or Woodfibre. These mills are closed down, pretty nearly. And the only thing going on, though, is gold mining. Lots of it. In the Bridge River country is opening up, in the Caribou, of course, and also indeed in the Upper Squamish Valley in the Ashu mine there's some activity there as well. And a few years after Emily is passing through Squamish, Squamish was in fact the busiest gold bullion port in the world. Nowhere in the world was as much gold handled as at Squamish in the late 1930s. So that's the significance of the gold mining during those tough years. Lots of activity, at least in gold. So she met a lot of miners along the way, not a lot of women travelers also. Now her connections to here, family and also other artists. There were artists before her that told Emily, extolled the virtues of the countryside, the beautiful scenery, and she also has family here. In fact, 2 nieces lived in Brackendale at different periods of time. Emily is here to visit in Brackendale in 1933 her favorite niece. And that is Lillian, who married Lawson Ray, the first Squamish-born generation of a pioneer settler family in Squamish, the Rays. And so she's here to visit with Lillian, who was a school teacher, and now she's busy running a dairy farm with her husband. And another niece, where we here now, would be, we'll come to her a little bit later. Elizabeth is another niece who came to live and managed the Brackendale store many years later. But another connection from the family to the Squamish Valley. So here's the Ray homestead in the 1930s. And Emily, in describing it, we'll come back to that. But she is here at the Ray farm, and it is a reminder that Emily is also a writer. And she is quite a, what shall we say, well, she's a delight to read as well as to admire and experience through her paintings. So she left home on May 15th in Victoria, went to Brackendale first. I was accompanied by Coco, who could not live without me, Tantrum, who must learn the job of mum minding while I'm sketching, so this is her menagerie that she's traveling with, and Susie the rat, whom no one would look after during my absence, so must of necessity come along. I had the usual paraphernalia of sketching, made as light as possible, but still heavy as one's heart in great affliction, the dogs, each in a cozy box, and Susie the rat finally settled in a rolled oak carton, cut down, this tucked under my bag. Now she says later elsewhere that when she was traveling she had to be careful about Susie. Susie puts on airs and considers herself one swell emancipated rat and rebels at laying low here, for if they knew of her existence they'd think I was a dafty. All of the minors, no doubt that she met along the way. So we got to Vancouver and we got to Squamish, got to Brackendale, along with vast quantities of prospectors going to the mines with their packs on their back. I rejoiced that their packs were even worse to behold than mine. Lil met me, and we traveled to her farm. How the kids had grown. Jolly bunch. So here we see the Ray's Dairy Farm, which operated up until 1957 in Squamish. And there's Lillian Ray in the bottom middle there. And she was long-time secretary of the Squamish Valley Farmers Institute until her retirement. Now, Emily describes, Lil met me and we traveled to her farm, then there were trips in the truck, walks in the rain, and splashing through puddles, waiting for the clouds to pass, and dashes out to sketch. What a tumble-up the farm was. We go back to the view of the Ray farm, and here's an excellent example of Emily Carr's writing, so entertaining. Young chickens, rabbits, bees, children, washing, cooking, picture, puzzles, picture, painting, post hole diggers, wire netting, shovels, brooms, school books and bags, lunch pails, clumping up and down stairs of hobnail boots, groan of kitchen pump, dash of churn, hum of cream separator, and other sights and sounds and smells, and Lil's voice roaring above all the hub-hub, first at this one, then at that. And it's interesting that she's just tucked away this piece of writing in her journals, not for publication, but she delights in writing, just as she delighted in sketching and painting. Now this is the other niece of Emily that took over the Brackendale store in the 1940s, and that is Elizabeth English, and she was married to a retired cannery operator from the north coast of BC, and so she is also somebody connecting us to the family. Both Lillian and Mrs. English also had some of Emily's paintings in their private collections, stashed under the bed, stashed behind the door, this sort of thing. Now, an artist during Emily's period in Vancouver in the years 1909, 1910, before her trip to France in 1911, she's teaching art in Vancouver and exhibiting as well. And at that time was in Vancouver Thomas William Fripp, who is, we can consider BC's first professional artist. He's trained in England. His brother is an architect also residing and busy in Vancouver in an architectural practice. And the Fripps were part of, if you like, the artistic scene of early Vancouver. And now Fripp was up here quite a bit, including up into the Pemberton Valley. We know from he was prolific in producing art, and this is from the setting of today's North Vancouver Outdoor School, or Checkmate Centre in the Paradise Valley, painting produced in 1909. Fripp was a favorite of the sort of uppity folks in Vancouver. They all had Fripp in their homes, and in the Terminal City Club, even yet to this day, has examples of Fripp's work. He's a little out of fashion, or came to be out of fashion, when Emily's generation comes along, of modernist approaches to landscape painting. But Thomas William Fripp, having been up here, produced massive amounts of sketches and paintings from our area here. No doubt was one of the people who educated Emily, made her aware of our countryside up here in the Squamish, Pemberton, and Lillooet areas. Now these are examples of Fripp's work. This is Mount Omega, seen from the Pemberton Trail, and here also from the Pemberton Trail. He was an early experimenter in photography, and we'll come across another example of one of his photographs later. But he would take photographs up in Garibaldi Park, was really one of the first pioneer in doing so, working from photographs. So his connection to Emily is that he probably facilitated her in early exhibits of her work in Vancouver, but certainly a very different school of art than Emily. Here's Mount Alpha from the Pemberton Trail, another example of Thomas William Fripp's work. And here's Thomas William Fripp, so a painter for the better classes, if you like, of Vancouver. And this is how he survived, of course, the first professional artist in British Columbia. And another artist that we should touch on is Josephine Crease, because Emily is not the first woman artist to go traveling out in the wilderness making sketches. She had a predecessor, also from Victoria. Josephine Crease is the daughter of Judge Henry Crease and his wife Sarah, and they are also a family of artists from England. And Josephine made her way to Squamish, and by that time probably around the turn of the last century by canoe, perhaps with a Squamish native guide, but made her way to Squamish and painted around the lower delta and of the mountains around there. And somebody that Emily would be very familiar with from Victoria, but I sense that again there's a little bit of a distance in styles and philosophy and modes of life between Emily and Josephine Crease, who was a little bit older. But Josephine would have ran the exhibit society in Victoria, or been among those people who are mounting exhibits of amateur artists in Victoria. Fred Varley is critical to our story of Emily Carr in this corridor, but also as a contemporary modernist. And Fred Varley is a founding member of the Group of Seven Painters, and Fred is a resident of Vancouver from about 1926, as I recall, and in 1927 was a breakthrough exhibition for Emily back east. And she's on her way from Victoria by the CPR, traveling back east, and she must stop in Vancouver to say hello to Fred Varley. And so she says in her journals, I left home Tuesday night, November 8th, this is 1927, at the Vancouver Art School. I met up with Mr. Varley. He was very pleasant and took me home with him. And his Garibaldi district sketches, most delightful. And so Emily is on her way back to take part in this exhibit of Canadian West Coast art, native and modern. Emily very much a part of this show. So she's discovered by the Group of Seven folks and the people around them. Emily is somebody they identify, an artist of interest out on the West Coast. And so this is 1927, and she's passing through Vancouver. So to pick up again with Fred Varley, he lived at Jericho Beach, out there at Point Grey. And there he is on his deck sketching, no doubt out into Howe Sound, as we see there in the painting on the right. And so again, Emily, his sketches most delightful, appealingly Canadian, a new delineation of a great country. a contemporary, a fellow modernist. And so this is really a significant encounter. And these would have been the paintings that Fred Varley is showing. I have a series of 4 examples here, 4 or 5 examples from Garibaldi Park. Fred has just returned, and he's finishing these up to also send back east to the same exhibit. And this is one, the Cloud Red Mountain, and you can see this is thoroughly a modernist approach to landscape painting, pioneering for British Columbia, and very inspiring for Emily, confirming what she also wants to do. Red Rock and Snow. Sunrise, Sphinx Glacier, with Garibaldi Lake just visible on the bottom of the painting. Mimulus, Mimulus Creek, Mist and Snow. And Dead Tree, Garibaldi. Whoops, there's one more. Garibaldi Reflections. So these are very inspirational for Emily, and they traveled back east also in 1927 to be placed on exhibit with other works of Group of 7 compatriots. So here we are in Brackendale, and Emily and her menagerie of pets that she traveled with. Probably on all of her travels she was accompanied by some of her pets. And this is a watercolor sketch of the Ray Farm, the photograph of which we've seen a little bit earlier. And she comes to the Ray Farm and finds out that her old friend Sophie, who is a Squamish Nation woman living in North Vancouver, who she became acquainted with around 1909 during a visit by ferry over to the North Shore to sketch and hang out. And she came to be friends with Sophie already years earlier, and as she turns up at the Ray Farm, she finds that Sophie is also on a visit with her husband, Jimmy Frank. There on the right, he's working on making a canoe, and from her journals, finding to my great joy that Sophie was in Brackendale, and Lil asking her and Frank, Jimmy Frank, and her sister and the child coming too, and the happy, comfortable time we all had, and Sophie so much to me, and I so much to Sophie, and the enjoyment of the good fool Lil provided. So Sophie's family, she's related to the Williams family of the Squamish Valley, and they are her father, who apparently was ill at this time, and this is the reason for her visiting. They're on the CHM Reserve, just very, very close to the Ray Farm. Frank, Jimmy Frank, had rowed up to Squamish in a dugout canoe of his own make. Sophie went by steamer. Frank was trying to sell the canoe. Lawson, Ray, wanted a boat for the river, so the deal went through very satisfactorily for all. Here is some early postcards of the Oudtslown village in North Vancouver, the Squamish Indian Mission, and St. Paul's Catholic Church there. And so Emily spent a great deal of time when she was hanging out in Vancouver those years, 1909, 1910, and came to know folks over here well. And there's Emily's own sketches of life over at the Squamish Mission Reserve in North Vancouver at Mosquito Creek. 1906 here. Now, this happens to be 2 photographs taken by Thomas William Fripp. As I mentioned, he was an early photography studio, was one of his occupations in Vancouver. And this happens to be 2 photos of Sophie. A little bit, probably 1910s, and we can see that she is busy making baskets. This is how she survived. Sophie was the mother of 21 children in Emily's journals, only 6 of whom I knew. She had already given birth and buried the others when I knew her. The 3 she brought with her on her first visit to my studio in Vancouver, and 3 later infants. One was named for me. I saw Sophie part with these 6, one by one. When life hit me hard, I went across the bay, Burrard Inlet, and sat a spell with Sophie. Her bare little house was clean. It faced the sea, and you could hear the lap or dash of waves on the beach at Sophie's door. The people in the village called me Sophie's Emily. She herself called me my Emily, and so I was. So here's Sophie. This is a painting that Emily made in 1914 and included as a frontispiece on her book, Clewick, that she published in 1941. It's a collection of essays about her experiences visiting Aboriginal communities around the coast, and it earned for Emily the Governor General's Award for Literature that year. But the frontispiece of that book is where she placed this painting of Sophie, which also hung in her studio as well. Very close relationship. Now here's Jimmy Frank, and on the bottom right there, and Jimmy is an uncle, if I'm not mistaken, of August Jack Castellano. There's a little bit of a separation in age between them, but Jimmy Frank, like August Jack, was also a great kind of informant to those wishing to know, in a kind of anthropological sense, more about the Squamish tribe. Jimmy Frank was one of the go-to people. And in fact, Jimmy Frank, and just next there is Harriet George, the oldest woman in the tribe at this time, and she died at over 100 years old some years later after this photo. But this is the Williams family home, and as I've mentioned, Sophie is part of the Williams family. Jimmy Frank was very well known to the folks in the Squamish Valley Farmers Institute. Used to share lots of knowledge and time with them. And for example, Eric Axon, a prominent farmer in Brackendale, was a good friend of Jimmy Frank. And Jimmy Frank also giving a lot of time to an American anthropologist, and he is single-handedly responsible for giving information on the Squamish people in this book on the Coast Salish of BC. So Emily is very close to this world of interpreting, informing about BC First Nations. And she was always accepted, it seems, in these communities. And this is her own sketch. And no doubt this is a scene that was very common throughout her life. She spent a lot of times in these villages on her travels. Mountains. This was Emily's mission on this trip, this PGE trip in 1933. And here we have two paintings from a group of 7-member, A.Y. Jackson of Jasper Park. And Emily would have seen these paintings in 1927 in her visit back east. And she writes, I've been looking at A.Y. Jackson's mountains in the CNR Jasper Park folder. 4 good color prints, but they do not impress me. They might be done from photographs, magnificent subjects, but decorative and commercial. Now, I could not do 1/10 as well, but somehow I don't want to do mountains like that. They don't feed or impress you. 1 or 2 looks does it. They pass through his eyes, but not his soul. So that's her verdict on these 2 mountain paintings by A.Y. Jackson. So, this is her mission on this trip, to take on mountains, something she had not done in her art until this time. And as she's traveling north, she writes, the settling down in the train with the creatures comfortably arranged for, and my eye all agog to absorb scenery. This is a sketch she's made, just passing through Cheakamus Canyon perhaps, or up that way. Mountains towering, snow mountains, blue mountains, green mountains, brown mountains, tree-covered, barren rock, cruel mountains with awful waterfalls and chasms and avalanches, tender mountains all shining, spiritual peaks way up among the clouds, Seton and Andersen lakes shut in by crushing mountains, a feeling of stifle, of being trapped, of oppression and depression, of foreboding and awe. The train slowly crawling along the lakeside of the trestled edge, then Lillooet at 8 p.m. So this is her description of coming through Andersen and Seton lakes by train. So we have here some shots of the scenery that she would have enjoyed, and Cheakamus Canyon, Brandywine Falls, which was a regular stop at that time, and Seton Lake down to the bottom. And at that time, the PGE Railway had introduced its observation cars, so they were as part of the trip at this time. And this is from Lillooet at the bottom there. The PGE, unlike the CPR and the CNR, as we've already seen, A.Y. Jackson was employed by the CNR to make some pictures of Jasper. The PGE did not engage in hiring artists for promotion. They were, of course, very interested to attract tourist traffic, but this did come eventually later in the 1940s. But the other two railways really did, especially the CPR, set an example in bringing artists on board, and many artists would consider themselves to be railway artists. They were very well supported by the railways, and their object, the railways, was to hire these artists to make pretty pictures for tourist traffic, to drum up the passenger traffic. So Emily the Modernist. Now, this is a painting that she's done after she comes back from France. She went to art school in France during 1911. She's back in 1911, and she may have expressed some opinions or other, but she has to respond in the newspaper, in the province newspaper in 1911. I have tasted the joys of the new modern art. I am a Westerner, and I'm going to extract all I can out of this big, glorious West. The new ideas are big, and they fit this big land. So she is taking on the art world. This is what they knew of Emily before her trip to France. Vancouver Harbour, views from the Fairview Slopes, Stanley Park, 1909. Not what we associate with Emily after her trip to France and her confrontation with modernist art in Europe. Contrast that with this from Emily of Vancouver Harbour, 1911-1912. It's quite a contrast. It probably provoked some reactions in the local scene, from Thomas William Fripp perhaps, and other folks, including her family. Now, Emily, just on the theme of modernist, being a modernist artist in faraway BC at this time. Just to illustrate the setting a bit, the Vancouver Art Gallery was built by Henry Stone, who was a prominent property developer in West Vancouver. Caulfield was developed by Henry Stone. Henry Stone's granddaughter happens to be Joan Brandwald, who was part of the Diamond Head Chalet project. But Joan Brandwald's grandfather Henry had some rather old-fashioned ideas about art, and when he led the campaign to establish the Vancouver Art Gallery on Georgia Street, this is 1931, and just completed in 1931, he sent a team to England to buy art, because there was nobody worthwhile to house in this gallery here from Western Canada. So all of these paintings, this is the first exhibit in the Vancouver Art Gallery in 1931, all purchased in England and brought back for this inaugural exhibition. So that was Henry Stone, prominent in support of the arts, but he had a particular vision of the arts at that time. And that would not have included the art of Emily Carr at this point. There were other lonely folks, pioneers in championing a modern approach, not only in art, but in literature. And one of these has some local connections. Alexander Maitland Stephen, A.M. Stephen, was a school teacher in Brackendale in 1905-1906. He didn't last very long because he had this practice of turning the portrait of the king or the queen, it may have been Queen Victoria, her portrait's still there, face into the wall, which irritated the local school board. So he didn't last too long as a school teacher in Brackendale, but he did make a living as a journalist and as a political campaigner, really. He was very much involved with the Spanish Civil War and the cause of Sun Yat-sen in China, raising money in Vancouver for these causes. He was a lefty, but he was also a campaigner for the Group of Seven. And the concept of that a place like Squamish, a place like Pemberton, here are places that you can make art about, that you can make art in. And his attitude comes through in his novel that is set in Squamish in 1906 when he lived there. He wrote the novel in 1929, just a couple of lines here. At the wharf, which was the point of contact between the valley and the other world, so Squamish as an isolated place. An unkempt figure. Who are the people that he's going to put in his art, in his novels? Ordinary folks. More worthy of study. Ordinary folks, ordinary little isolated places are worthy of study, according to Stephen, according to Emily Carr. The types on the waterfront of a seaport, a little seaport like Squamish. The loggers who crowded at saloons. These people are worthy of study, worthy of art. The Squamish. Nobody had written a novel about Squamish or set in Squamish, and still to this day. Back to nature, another theme for Emily, for Alexander Maitland Stephen. Wonderful nature descriptions, and for the group of 7. That's their generation, but they're not on top yet, as they later came to be by the 1940s and 1950s. These are the recognized generation of art and literature in Canada, but not at this time, in the 20s and 30s. So this is some of Stephen's campaigning. Home writers are worth study. You don't need to go back to England to buy paintings for the Vancouver Art Gallery. There's art being produced here. There's art that can be produced here. High art can be produced here too. Canadianism, a central theme of Stephen's addresses. He's going across the country lecturing, promoting the cause of Canadian literature, Canadian painting, the group of 7 painters. And here we are, just a couple more of these. Here we are. Stephen pleaded for appreciation of Canadian art, not English painting. Canadian literature as a nation builder. And this is what we've already heard from Emily. This is big. I'm a Westerner. Stephen will give recital in Winnipeg. Canadian writer pays tribute to native literature, native painting. So this is what the group of 7 are all about. And what is very unique and special about her trip up here through the sea to sky country of today is that she's in contact through the Brackendale post office with a group of 7 back in Toronto. They're sending her letters because she has just become a member of their group, retitled the Canadian Group of Painters. So the Canadian Group of Painters takes over as the title of their society, their exhibit club, in 1933. And there's several new members, including Emily from the West Coast. Bess Hauser is writing out to Emily. Emily has sent back some sketches, and she wants to have their views. What do they think? And so they write back, and she picks up the letter at the Brackendale post office on her way up to Pemberton a little bit. So here we have the group of 7 are in this famous photograph of them: Barley, Jackson, these literary people, literary critic Barker Fairley, Johnston. Johnston also visited Squamish, by the way. Lismer and J.H. MacDonald also made trips out to the West Coast. So in 1933, they are expanded into this Canadian group of painters that includes Emily, Charles H. Scott, W.P. Weston, and Jock MacDonald, a very close associate of Fred Varley at this time. And all of these people very much admirers of Emily as well. So they are part of an expanded group of 7 called the Canadian Group of Painters, 1933. And you can see how they are affiliated. Emily's painting of Pemberton Meadows, 1933. 1927, Black Tusk by Charles H. Scott. Early 1950s, Mount Mamquam by W.P. Weston. And 1927, I think that is, from Jock MacDonald. So they are clearly allied in their approach, a modernist approach to landscape painting. Now, what Emily has done is sent some sketches back to them, and what she's wanting to explain is that she's trying out something new. It's a kind of a sketching medium I've used the last 3 or 4 years, and she really is cultivating this method during this particular trip. Oil, paint, thinned with gasoline on paper. I feel I've gained a lot by its use. Here are some examples. Light to carry and allows great freedom of thought and action. Woods and skies out west are big. You can't squeeze them down. Lauren Harris, of the group of 7, felt I ought to be working more on canvases, but I was stubborn because I was after something. Even sketches to me are canned food. I like it fresh. Carry it right home and use it. And this is what she thought she could achieve, what she did achieve, with this oil on paper method. And so they wrote back to her and just gave her just a very enthusiastic review. I took them, Bess, who is Lauren Harris's partner, I took them with me to one of our great Canadian group of paintings, group of 7 meetings, all greatly moved and excited by them. Your sketches, Emily. You had sent them because you felt flat and wanted some reactions. Well, enthusiasm displayed by all. Great, very beautiful. Now, you know, that's really significant praise and a significant time in her career and right on her journey through our part of the world. What a great encouragement. Now, modernist paintings. Some of these artists had made this transition as Emily did. This is W.P. Weston. When he came to British Columbia, he'd been trained in England, and he was producing stuff like this. Perhaps a scene from the Fraser Valley. Deciduous trees. There, in 1917, W.P. Weston became an important art educator in BC, and long career. But this is what he evolved to, and he describes it in his own journals and writings, that he had to confront our mountains. This is how he had to get beyond what he'd been trained in, to confront this new landscape that was very different, required a totally different approach. So this is Howe Sound and Mount Garibaldi. He was prolific in painting around Howe Sound, liked to work from his boat, and somebody who went over to pay visits to Emily Carr in Victoria was a great admirer of Emily Carr, and she set an example for him, as he himself admitted. Another painter, more influenced here by Fred Varley, with whom he was a colleague at one of the Vancouver art schools, Charles H. Scott, also trained in Britain, and this may perhaps be a scene from the Lower Fraser or the Lower Skagit, and somewhere in that country, but in the old style that he'd been trained in here in 1924. This is what he evolved to. His portrait, remarkable painting of Black Tusk, very dramatic. And this is in the Vancouver Art Gallery collection, 1927, on his trip up in the park with Fred Varley in that year. The same year that produced those works that Emily had seen passing through town earlier in 1927. 1940s up in the Bridge River country. So very different approaches that Charles H. Scott evolved to from the example set by Fred Varley and also Emily Carr. So in the early 1930s, the Garibaldi Park and Squamish districts, this was a laboratory for modern landscape painting. And the next generation of landscape painters, the E.J. Hughes generation, one of the more prominent members of it, all students of Varley and MacDonald and Charles H. Scott, they decided to use Garibaldi Park. This is under the leadership of Varley and MacDonald. They would be up there all summer long doing sketches with their students. Artists to visit Garibaldi, selected by the directors of the school, the College of Arts. And so Emily is very much aware of this. This is 1934, the year after her visit here. But she's already, by this time, 63 years old. She's not going to be accompanying these young students up into the park. And she regrets this, that she would have loved to be able to have been up there. And that's not something that she's probably going to be able to obtain that experience at this time in her life. But they're all very attuned to Emily Carr, all of these students and their instructors. Now, the reception of these modern painters. These 4 paintings we've seen already. They were the ones produced by Fred Varley, group of 7 member in 1927 in Garibaldi Park, that Emily so admired. Well, how were they received in 1927, 1928 in Toronto? Mess of chili sauce. is the description of one work of art, according to the Telegram, and of course the editor or the commentators agreeing. The group of 7 display their annual symbolisms. That's how they received modern painting in Toronto in 1928. Junk clutters art gallery walls, while real paintings, perhaps the ones that Henry Stone would have put on display in the Vancouver Art Gallery years later, are hidden in the cellar. Serious responsibility has to be accepted by the Council of Toronto Art Gallery in permitting exhibitions such as that now on view, which included Emily Carr as well. Another thing about Emily, her reputation originally was from her paintings of First Nations villages up and down the coast, Vancouver Island, up in Haida, and this made her reputation in artist circles and otherwise. And still here in 1928, this is how she is depicted. Some ladies prefer Indians. So this is how they received Emily Carr in the top newspapers of the country, art pages in 1928. So there's a ways to go. Here locally in the Squamish Times, 1961, some of these art paintings that were produced in the late 20s in Garibaldi Park by these modernists. Here, Grace Melvin, another instructor at the Vancouver School of Art. And Frida Monroe, she says here, the paintings shown here were a critic's exhibit rather than one for the general public. Most of her work gave the impression of being hastily colored sketches. The only pictures among the lot with general appeal were a few Welsh scenes, which were adequately understandable. So that they're really, all of this group, even into the 60s, they're really on the outside of things. And so it was some time before they became mainstream. Lawrence Harris is part of that story, of bringing these artists mainstream. He had personal wealth, which was a good platform, gave him a good platform to do this, and he was the executor of Emily Carr's paintings. He was most particularly interested in those that he admired and were closer to his tastes and also influence, his influence over Emily. But in 1946 here, this is after her passing, and he's the executor, and there is an example of a painting from a particular period in Emily's career that's a little bit different than what she is producing during her trip here. Now, we'll show an example of Lauren Harris, and this is Mountain Forms. That is on exhibit in 1930 in Montreal, and Emily is visiting Montreal, and she writes, Harris's Mountain Forms was beautiful. It occupied the center of one wall, one great cone filled with snow and serenely rising to a sky filled with wonderful light around it to halo-like circles. Forms purplish in color lead up to it. He gets a strip of glorious cold green in the foreground, and the whole sky is sublimely serene. She's a great admirer. I sat and watched it for a long, long time. I wished I could sweep the rest of the wall bare. The other pictures jarred. 2 fashionable women came in and others called. They laughed and they scoffed. After wondering if the thing was an angel cake, they consulted the catalog. Oh, it's Mountain Forms. They all laughed. How I longed to slap them. Others came and passed without giving more than a brief withering glance. A priest came. Surely he would understand. Wouldn't the spirituality of the thing appeal to one whose life was supposed to be giving up to those things? He passed right by, even though he walked twice through the room. Blind, blind! So, this is a few years prior to her visit here, and it's part of her influence in taking on mountains, and with mainly the same concept of finding that sublime in our mountains here. But here from an older cartoon that Emily has made herself, she's quite capable of taking her purse and smacking somebody, which she sounds like she was ready to do in the Montreal Art Gallery. Now, There's a limit to how far she goes with Lauren Harris in his artistic journey. And this is an example of his later career where he was very much into abstract art. And she writes, Lauren Harris is now deep in abstract form and has written me long letters on the subject wanting me to try it out, but I have no desire to. I can't get the link up. Is it something that has stopped and so lost its interpretive meaning and become empty? What is the good of inventing a new language if there's no one to talk to? So we find Emily now at the top end of her travels in Lillooet, and she's plunged into work. Oh, these mountains, great bundles of contradiction, hard, cold, austere, disdainful, remote yet gentle, spiritual, appealing. Oh, you mountains, I am at your feet, humble, pleading, speak to me your wordless words. I claim my brotherhood to you. So this really gives a sense of what her mission was about when she was traveling here. Oh, Father, raise my consciousness to that sense of oneness with the universal. Help me to express thee. Do thou use me as a channel. Help me to keep myself clear, open, receptive to thy will. Open my understanding and make my eye to see and my ear to hear. Let me not fuss and fret at my incompetence, but be still and know that thou art God. God in nature. But it is a Christian God. Lauren Harris was no longer a Christian, but a practicing theosophist, and that is something else that Emily did not share with him or would not. She remained a practicing Christian to the end of her days. Another passage in her writings on mountains, in a journal entry from Seaton, in fact a letter from Seaton Portage. Mountains, mountains everywhere, towering up above you in all senses. At first sight they terrified me. That was around Darcy. They are so austere, but here they are kindlier, here at Seaton Portage. And I'm getting to love them more every day. As they're painting them well, they make you feel like an ant, but I'm very happy, even in my acute incompetence. She was very prolific, Emily, in sketching in all of her time and her travels. And she would probably be producing as many as 4 or 5 sketches a day during her time here. We don't have very many of them. We probably have less than a third have been preserved and available, preserved for public, mostly by the Royal BC Museum, but a lot in private collections too, of course. But these are just some examples that have been preserved from her time here. And this is probably her first day in Lillooet, wandering about town there at the bottom there, sketching the profile of the main street of Lillooet. The graveyard, and Laurie Carter has done some good work to identify the locations of some of these places that she visited and sketched. We'll find out some of them are not very easy to find today because the churches have disappeared through fire and other mishaps. Something that's interesting about Emily, this is it at Lillooet looking across to the Fountain Ridge, is that she was not very enthusiastic about bodies of water. In fact, she never was. Only briefly did she spend a significant amount of energy sketching and painting seascapes. But rivers were another thing that she never really got accustomed to. In the sketch on the top here, in contrast to the photo at the bottom, she's removed the Fraser River from her sketch, looking across the valley. Here is the village of Teeket in Lillooet proper, and up on the hillside, a sketch she's made. And here we have a contemporary photograph. The church is in the middle of the photograph. You can have a sense of what she's done, how she's rendered the hillside here. She spent probably a few days just in this village. Several sketches, several paintings have come through this visit. So there again is Teeket in oil, worked up from into oil. And here is the same village, and the church is off the distant area with the cemetery in the foreground. Go back and see the painting, and here's the photograph of the setting. These also from Teeket, the same church. which was lost, I believe, in the early 1970s in a brush fire. That's happened with a lot of the older buildings in this part of the province. And down there at the bottom, a postcard from 1920s. And the same village in Emily's oil painting rendering. The same church, gone. So this photograph, I believe, is 1936. So just a few years after Emily's visit. This church on the left, Emily has put it out in the open, but Laurie Carter, the journalist, has located this church in downtown Lillooet. It's the Catholic Church in Lillooet, and it's still there today. Seton Lake. Emily spent several days here and hanging out with the miners, staying at one of the lodges, and this is where she worked up a few noteworthy oil on paper sketches. Very nice one. And the two local churches documented. This is St. Christopher's, and this church is gone now. The steeple was replaced at a certain time, causing a little bit of confusion for us trying to puzzle out which church is which. But this is now in probably advanced decay as a building, not retained. The other one, though, nearby here's the St. Christopher's again, 1936, not long after Emily visited and sketched it and painted it. And this is another one, St. Mary's at Nikiat, and this one is how it's roughly seen today. So these paintings and sketches of Emily are in fact of significance to First Nations of this corridor. It's documentation, and there isn't a lot of their villages of this sort. This is some interiors in the churches at Seton Portage. And she writes, "As I knelt in the little Catholic church, this came to me. Crude pictures of Christ and the Virgin and St. Joseph, as the church is too little and poor to buy statues. Such a few moneyless Indians left in the village, such a full graveyard. No sound but a mother hen calling outside her chicks, and the chortle of blackbirds getting food for their young. Great peace. What was there, I asked, in the crude pictures on the wall, this folk art, that inspiring your reverence, that lifted your spirit and satisfied surely? They were very crude, not works of art as the world counts art. But the answer came, no, they're works of spirit. The makers of these originals had sought to portray not man or woman, but to find symbols for love, purity, and holiness. So I said to myself, must I seek spiritual symbols, attributes of God in this that I would paint? This is a painting that is one of Emily Carr's most well-known paintings. It's in the McMichael collection in Ontario, hanging with the numerous, mostly group of 7 artists. And it is painted at below Mission Mountain. This is the Mission Mountain at Shalaf. And the church in the bottom was lost to a fire in 1968, which is one of the puzzles to solve without the church to help us identify it. But in fact, it is from that location. And she spent some time here on the shores of Seton Lake. And that's the church that was lost, St. Paul's, that is featured in that painting. And at the back, you can see the shapes of Mission Mountain. Beautiful and exhausting Pemberton. So this is one of her lengthier stops. And it's interesting that she wrote already before coming, I took a notion to it on the way up. So blue in the hills, so green in the fields. So blue in the hills, so green in the fields. Now I must away to work. I plan to climb a mountainside. Here we are. 3 days at Pemberton have passed already. It is beautiful and exhausting. First day they told me of a walk. Said it was 4 miles. It proved to be 6, and I got home exhausted and mad, also late. I expect a glorious panorama and to walk 5 miles. I crossed 3 railway bridges, beastly things. The mountains glorious, tossing splendor and glory from peak to peak. Yesterday there was fresh snow. They are half white and half navy blue in the beastly treacherous Lillooet River. Snakes through the willows and the meadows. I don't like these rivers. They are oily smooth and swift but swirling, with mean currents and whirlpools. You feel as if they asked you sneakily and stealthily to fall in and be swallowed, swept away swiftly to nothingness. There is meanness in their muddy green-gray water and their shelby sandbanks. I never go to the rivers about here, or want to look at them or hear them. Well, after miles and miles along the tracks, I climbed the wagon road to Harvey Mountain. At the summit I sat to rest and made a sketch. The view was certainly fine in a middling way, but not all the wonder they raved over, so I suppose this was only the beginning and the trail went up from there. On and on and on. It got worse and worse, perpendicular, stony, ghastly. Still I struggled on. From the amount of bear spoor, there must have been millions about it. It was fresh. Would I meet one? Would it be ugly in attack? Surely, I thought, this is a queer trail to set a woman of 62 off on a lope. But I hated to be a slacker, and so I turned back and I toiled on. I'm getting out, I said, and consigning my informants at the hotel to hot places, I started the descent and kept going without pause. When I limped into the hotel kitchen, they were appalled. "My goodness," said the daughter. "You got to the top that we met when you started on the trail. You must have got onto the old McCullough trail up to an old mine. Why, I wouldn't dream of going up there without a man." Counting that awful climb, I must have gone 9 or 10 miles. I ached dreadfully. That was her Pemberton experience. But from that experience, she produced one of the masterpieces of her trip. Back in Victoria, of course, rendering it up from her sketch. But this is Pemberton Meadows, the only oil painting we have done here in Pemberton, but not necessarily the only one. But the one that is now in the collection of the Vancouver Art Gallery, so in public hands, and really one of the joys, one of the prizes of Emily Carr's oeuvre. So she's back in the studio in Victoria in the summer and through into the fall, and you can see all of her oil on paper sketches are laid out here that she's working up oil paintings from. And a Victoria photographer dropped by, and these are very interesting photos because we can do some detective work about the paintings that we don't know the fate of. One of the people that dropped by was a photographer, a fellow from Vancouver, who was a kindred spirit. His medium was photography, but here to offer a critical remarks, conversation regarding her work from this trip. And so 2 artists, photographers came to the studio today. They were very enthusiastic over my work, said it was individual and I was getting something. Am I? I worked happily for a few weeks grinding in some of my long commenced canvases. I think some of them are waking and beginning to move a little. It's vastly interesting. So this is our Dutch Vancouver photographer. He was a man on Robson Street and a great friend of young artists in Vancouver. And this is an example of his photography, which really did appeal to Emily. So very much part of the modern art community, as I've been emphasizing. This is a painting that Emily struggled with. This is we're at Shalaf and the Mission Mountain. Oh, these mountains, they won't bulk up. They are thin and papery. At 'em again, old girl, they're worth the struggle. So this is a sketch on the left, and the final product that's in the Michael collection, the mountain on the right there. I wiped out the village at the foot of the mountain. I must express all else subservient to that great dominating strength and spirit rooted in that mountain. Oh, my mountain, I'm like a tiny rowboat trying to tow it into port, and the sea is rough. Oh, that mountain, I'm dead beat tonight with struggling. October 6th, my mountain is dead. As soon as she is dried, I'll bury her under a decent layer of white paint and top her off with another picture. But I haven't done with the old lady, far from it. Oh, if I can only make her throb into life, a living, moving mass of splendid power and volume. That's what she's after. Now, here's some examples of some sketches on the top and the oil paintings that she worked up from them on the bottom in her studio in Victoria. In working out canvas from sketches, the sketches should convey the essence of the idea, though they lack the detail. The thing that decided you to attempt that particular subject should be shown, more or less. Take that small sketch home and play with it on paper with cheap materials so that you may not feel hampered, but dabble away gaily. Extravagantly play with your idea, keep it fluid, toss it hither and thither, but always let the idea be there at the core. When certainty has arrived in your mind, leave the sketch alone, forget it, and put your whole thought into developing the idea in the oil on canvas. Now, of these paintings, we have to do some detective work, as I mentioned. We have the fountain ridge there at the top, but there's much that we don't know as to the fate of sketches and paintings from her trip on this PG trip, Squamish, Brackendale, Pemberton, up to Lillooet and back. We have 15 sketches, and these are all of them. And they're pretty much all, I think, in the collection of the Royal BC Museum. They were collected by an enthusiast, somebody that really admired the way Emily had, her career in traveling the province, in documenting, in particular, the Aboriginal people of the province. Mr. Newcomb, who was a curator at the museum. And he really saved a lot of her work that would have otherwise disappeared, including all of these sketches from her trip in 1933. These are the 4 oil paintings that we have, or know of, from this trip. And the mountain, done from Shalaf. The Teepket village, again, down the bottom left, Teepket village at Lillooet. And the Pemberton Meadows painting. These are the 4 oil paintings that survive, or that we know from the trip. However, in her various notations, we have references to others, including a Brackendale landscape worked into oil that we don't know the whereabouts of, a tree with moving background, perhaps done in the Squamish Valley, and from her entry in April 3rd, 1937, an old Vancouver pupil took a Pemberton sketch, also for $15. How lucky I am, or rather, how well taken care of. And another reference to perhaps what we already do have, the Lillooet Indian village, the village of Teepket. So, October 17th, 1933, she's almost ready to send them off to her exhibit back east. The mountain is finished. Finally. The Brackendale landscape and the tree with moving background will be coffined tomorrow and sent away. They ought not to go out as pictures, finished. I feel them incomplete studies, just learners, not showers. Will I ever paint a shower, forgetting the paint and remembering the glory? I will not berate them. I've wrestled with them honestly. Now I put them in front of me, and I push on to the next. And I carry on with me some bit of knowledge and growth acquired through them. Onward, up. So we come home again to Pemberton. This is a painting that likely was produced from the Plateau, a new residential subdivision just on the west side of the village of Pemberton, and looking at Mount Currie. But we're so fortunate to have this prize product from her time here in this corridor. And had she been able, I'm sure that she would have returned it again. It is in all of her writings about this trip, they come alive. And a happy time, an interesting time, stimulating time for Emily Carr, and a struggle to achieve what she wanted to achieve, taking on the mountains. But in this painting, we can say, yes, she did. Thank you very much.